Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 2 of your Bish Therapist podcast. I am Melissa Reich, your Bish Therapist. This podcast is hosted by me, a real life therapist turned pop culture enthusiast. For those of you who are new listeners, welcome. Just announced my podcast yesterday on Amy Phillips' show, and it's been a real whirlwind ever since. So, being aware of the fact that I have a lot of new listeners, I'm going to, each episode kind of just reiterate who I am and, explain what this podcast is all about. So, what the podcast is about is your Bish therapist giving you very hot takes and clinical interpretations of observable behavior in the media. So, Bravo, true crime, I'm really here for all of it. Now, today, this is a very, very special episode of your Bish therapist. I am going to cover part 1, 2, and 3 of the podcast with Bethenny and Rachel Leviss. I had so many thoughts after part 1 that I tried doing a post and it just didn't do it justice. So I wanted to really devote an entire episode to each part of this interview. For me, I feel this is such an important topic to focus on because so much was talked about in terms of mental health and advocacy and HIPAA, which clearly Rachel is not aware of what HIPAA is. So what I am going to do is explain today my clinical interpretations and thoughts of the interview parts 1, 2, and 3. I'm going to give you a broad strokes overview of my initial impressions. I am going to go into specific things that were said in part 1, 2, and 3 of the interview and share a little bit about, as I said, talk about mental health advocacy. What does that actually mean? I'm going to define HIPAA and explain what that is. And this is no shade because for practitioners like myself, HIPAA is something that's important for us to be aware of. Not everybody has an understanding of HIPAA. So fair enough. I'm going to explain that. I've seen a lot of confused people online and a lot of people wanting me to discuss this. So here I am. This podcast today, I'm just going to talk until I'm done. And, normally I want to try to keep podcasts pretty bite-sized, digestible pieces because, listen, we all have a lot of podcasts we listen to. We all have a lot of content we take in. And I am not so entitled to believe that I deserve all of your time. Your time is valuable. So normally I want to do that. I could probably talk about this for hours. I won't. And if I end up having a lot of thoughts on it and it is simply too long for one episode, I, may split it up. So, to be determined on that. So the first thing that I want to do is give some general impressions of the overall interview. Most of us who aren't living under a rock have seen a lot of, to quote Rachel's word, vitriol, which is a great word and it's very descriptive, but I just noticed she said it a lot, so we'll go with that. There's been so much vitriol online about people being angry and upset with Bethenny and people being upset with Rachel. So what people appreciate about me, at least the feedback that I've received, which thank you to everyone who has just been so kind and so supportive. I'm just overwhelmed with gratitude and I appreciate all of you. So thank you very much. But what I want to do is kind of give a unbiased, two sides of the coin view to everything, to what Bethenny said, to what Rachel said. I'm a human and I have my own opinions, but as a therapist and as a clinician, I just want to point out, some really important pieces. What is so fascinating about all of this? 100 people can watch the same episode of a show and have 100 different opinions. So our perspective is our reality, point blank. Whatever happens up here, between our ears is our reality. And I think that for me, it was important to hear and listen for myself to each and every segment of the interviews, because so many Bravo accounts have covered this and they're really doing such amazing work. Shout out to all you amazing hardworking Bravo accounts. There have been so many people who have recapped what was said. For me as a therapist, most of the important stuff is in not what's said, but how it's said, in the body language, in the, physicality of how people react when they're talking about things. Those things tell me more than actually what was said. I wanted to hear, Bethenny's tone of voice, Rachel's tone of voice. I wanted to hear all that. And I didn't want to just take, snippets of kind of what people have said. So I really did the research, unlike Bethenny. I really listened. I wish there was a way we could have watched it. And if there is, maybe I'm wrong, please let me know. But for me as a therapist, I do a lot of interpretation of body language and things like that. And that does help me form an opinion. So I definitely did not experience that. But the things when we experience and hear interviews like this, our perspective is shaped by our traumas or our experiences of things that have happened. So, and that's going back to perspective is reality. So I'm not saying I'm the authority on this. I'm just going to give you my opinions and clinical feedback based on my perspective. So the first thing I'll start with, I'm going to do some overarching things that I noticed. The first thing that I noticed is that Bethenny was so ill prepared for this interview that as a professional person, it just irritated me. I'm going to be honest. I think that, people compared her to Howie Mandel. And to be honest, I think that's more than fair. I don't understand how you could sit in front of a microphone and share perspectives and thoughts and analysis and assessment of something that you are not even aware of. To be honest, I feel that's irresponsible. And it just goes to show that, just having a microphone in front of you doesn't always mean the content that you're going to get is balanced. So, as a consumer, I encourage you all to be really thoughtful in how you consume shows, because, to me, Bethenny and Howie did a grave disservice to both the people that they interviewed and the general public. Bethenny didn't watch the show. She said she didn't watch the show. She watched the reunions, which is better than nothing. But she hasn't watched Vanderpump Rules at all. And she was doing something that I found very odd, which is she was researching as she was interviewing Rachel, like actively on the podcast, which again, to me, and listen, in fairness, I'm going to tell you right now, I'm type A. Okay. So I'm a little bit perfectionistic. I definitely take a lot of pride in my work. And for me, what comes out of your mouth is really important. And I'm very thoughtful about it. I think what irritates people about Bethenny is she can be very reckless with her words. She speaks in a lot of, she speaks in, I can't think of the word I'm looking for. She speaks in extremes and then ends up being very contradictory. And so I find when people speak impulsively without coming from a place of understanding, you do get this wild back and forth swinging perspectives and opinions. So part of what I do with this podcast is I do everything to avoid that. I try to be very thoughtful and approach things and do research. Um, it was just sloppy to me. It was sloppy, and it came across in the interview as if, you know, Bethenny just wanted to get this out. She was clearly eager and anxious to have the public hear this, which, you know, I get it. As a podcaster, I do understand that. But for me, I'm never going to put something out before I'm ready and before I've researched it. That's just me. Um the One of the other things that I noticed is that there were so many ads. Okay. So people are talking about, you know, Bethenny exploiting Rachel just like everybody else is exploiting her. And to be honest, I reserved judgment until I listened to the podcast. And what became so apparent to me is it was more ad than it was podcast. So what does that tell me? Okay, that tells me a couple things. That tells me that Bethenny made a lot of money on ads. Um, she also gets paid per download. So the sloppiness of just getting it out and then all the ads and all of that kind of tells me that there was a self-serving purpose to it for sure, which again, no shade. I mean, you know, some could say this is self-serving, right? I'm looking at their interview and I'm sharing my thoughts on it. But I'm doing it free. It's ad free, and well, at least on YouTube. It may not be on Acast, and I don't have total awareness of that yet. But um, you know, there are differences. But I do think it's important to not acknowledge that, you know, all of us to an extent, you know, we're taking this information and we're, you know, putting our spin on it and we're putting it out there. So I think we have to be careful throwing stones at each other. Um, but clearly Bethenny made some money on this interview and Rachel did not. So the one thing at the end that I did hear from Bethenny is that she flew to Arizona where Rachel is now residing, and at least temporarily. Um, so Bethenny flew down there, and she initially said, and forgive me for those of you watching video, I'm going to be kind of looking at notes. It's just so much, I can't keep it all in my brain. But Bethenny flew out to Arizona. And at first, Bethenny said, I did it so that you would, you know, feel safe and comfortable, which I thought, well, that's okay. That's sweet. That's kind. That's considerate. People were saying, well, you know, she probably made Rachel pay for airfare, blah, blah, blah. So Rachel did not have to pay for any airfare. Bethenny came to her. But then Bethenny said that she was afraid that Rachel was going to get cold feet. And so it took that kind of like, oh, that was sweet. And it quickly, for me, told me that this is still very self serving for Bethenny. It's great for her to say that she did it for Rachel to be safe and comfortable. And listen, maybe part of her did. But then she immediately gave herself away. She told on herself when she said that she was afraid she would get cold feet. So, you know, that kind of was interesting there. I want to address the overarching topic of, you know, Bethenny doing this. Like, what are her reasons for doing this? You know, people are saying that, you know, she's taking advantage of Rachel and all these things. And I want to say that altruism or helping others is something that people often get, you know, there's a term, it's called helper's high, quote unquote, helper's high, which just means that people who help people, myself included, there are secondary gains always when we help somebody. And even the secondary gain might just be it makes us feel good. It makes us feel happy to be helpful to people. And I certainly, you know, have experienced that. I love helping people. I've dedicated my life to it. But what is frustrating to me is that Bethenny is unable to claim altruism when she is ironically part of the same machine that she's trying to dismantle. I'm just going to say that. Now, Bethenny is trying to give Rachel the opportunity to share her voice and all these things, but there are obviously secondary gains that Bethenny is getting here. And I think that we can't ignore that. Um, and I do think that there's an irony in, Bethenny is trying to take down the machine of, the Bravoverse and reality TV and all these things, but she is also a part of that in doing all of this with Rachel, which again, fine. But I think that if Bethenny had just acknowledged that, people would be less frustrated with her. She's just giving a lot of very black and white behavior, a lot of extremes. When she was all in with Bravo, she was all in with Bravo. There were tweets that came out that she, Aviva Drescher, someone had said that Bravo forced them to drink, and she tweeted saying, like, that is not true. This has never been true, and blah, blah, blah. And now she's saying the opposite years later. So it just comes off as very disingenuous. And I think that's what leads people to feel frustrated, which I understand that. The last thing I'm going to say overall before I get into the nitty gritty of it all is that I think two things: that Bethenny did appear to be empathetic, kind, and caring towards Rachel. Okay, so as a human being, I just appreciate the humanness that Bethenny showed Rachel, because whatever you all think about Rachel, she is a person who did some bad stuff, made some really bad choices. What she did was terrible, but she's a human. And I think that can't get lost in the sauce. I think that from hearing the interview as a trained clinician, I can tell that she received real treatment. Not just like, people go to treatment facilities all the time, and either the treatment facility isn't great, or you could go to the greatest treatment facility in the world, but if you're not ready to change and utilize the tools you learn, it's not going to do anything. I can tell Rachel did go to a real good treatment center and that she did gain insight and awareness. I can tell that. But I can also understand why people feel frustrated, because Rachel seemed to take accountability, but then kind of make excuses and backstep and backpedal on certain things. So I think that's why people are frustrated. So I'm going to go over some specific things and then talk a little bit about where I feel there were wins and where I feel there weren't, and maybe some room for improvement. So what I'm going to do is pull up my notes. So we'll do part one first. I'll go over that part first, because in part one, Rachel talks a lot about treatment and, where she went, what she learned, why did she go. So I'm just going to read you some notes that I have, some thoughts on that. So Rachel confirmed she did go to a treatment facility in Arizona called the Meadows for 90 days, which I will say, something in my brain just kind of made a mental note. She kept mentioning the Meadows. And so I'm hoping that she's just doing that not out of a sense of obligation or like an advertising deal or something. She's just sharing where she went. But that did stick in my mind a little bit. So she says she went to examine her choices to figure out why she continues to find herself in unhealthy relationships, and she wanted to identify what she needs to change. She reports wanting to know the why behind her behaviors, which, bravo, great. I think that the human race would be far better off if we all tried to focus on ourselves and figure out, okay, well, if I did something crappy, why did I do what I did? Let me figure this out so that I can do better next time. And so initially when she said that, I thought, well, that's great. And I give her a lot of credit for that. The one thing she said she learned a lot about in treatment was toxic shame versus healthy shame, which I think is something really interesting. I haven't heard a lot of other accounts talk about, but I did want to address it. So, what that means is the treatment facility wants, and her therapist wants her to take accountability for her behaviors, but what they don't want her to do is take more accountability than is hers to take. And toxic shame can be just really awful and impossible to live with. But healthy shame kind of means, okay, I acknowledge I did A, B, and C. These are the consequences of my behavior. Here's what I'm going to do to change that. But sometimes we do need to feel bad about the things that we've done. But we have to do it in a way that's not punishing or, self-harmy or anything like that. So for me, that's a little bit of what that means. She talked about while she was in treatment feeling, um, she had an offer to go to treatment before the reunion, but she went to the reunion because she felt like she needed to fulfill her work obligation, which again, I think is amazing. I mean, LVP didn't show up to the reunion for a lot less. So I will give her credit for, she went and she took the beating and she knew what she was going to get and she did it anyway. So kudos to her about that. She learned in treatment that she shared her authentic story and she was met with grace and compassion from her peers, and she's learning to forgive herself and be compassionate, which again, great. She can't, as mad as anybody listening to this might be, she cannot continue to flog herself for public approval. I mean, she's a human person and she needs to work on it and move forward. You can't get stuck in it. So I also give her a lot of credit for that. The why behind her behaviors that I found really interesting is I had another clairvoyant moment where I posted about this before. I theorized that she either was going to say or she really did experience a sex and love addiction. And she did say in the interview that it took a while for her to accept, but she acknowledged having a quote unquote love addiction and talked a little bit about her codependency and, kind of being addicted to love and, leading her to make bad choices with Sandoval. My goal is to do another entire podcast on the topic of sex and love addiction because it's a really complex topic, and it does go hand in hand with addiction and codependency and mental health issues and all these things. So I think it's a great topic. If you're interested in hearing about, I can definitely do an episode about that. I have a really good friend who has her PhD in psychology with a focus on sexual health and development, and I'm hoping that maybe she'd be willing to come on the podcast and give her thoughts about that as well. She talked about her name change. She addressed that, and it was kind of what was in the media, which is essentially she was born Rachel, but when she was in third or fourth grade, she was young, and there were a bunch of other Rachels, and she wanted to feel special and unique, so she chose the name Raquel. And she admits she wasn't comfortable in her own skin. She claims she wanted to be someone better, which is so sad. Imagine being in like third grade and feeling like, well, I'm not special and I need to be better. I mean, that definitely tells me that she has been open about her family history of being adopted and the kind of interesting circumstances around that. Her birth mother is her biological. So her birth mother gave Rachel up for adoption to her sister. So Rachel's mother is really biologically her aunt. and her aunt and uncle raised her as her parents. She calls them mom and dad, and they are. I'm not diminishing that in any way, shape, or form. I'm just trying to explain the family tree, because just a friendly reminder that family does not always mean blood. In fact, sometimes it really doesn't. And people who are adopted and fostered and things like that are, family is family. So just a really quick comment on that. But in treatment, what I theorized in a post was that if she really did seek treatment, reintegrating the name would be part of her treatment. And I was correct. It is. So I'm going to explain. Reintegration is kind of a technique that therapists use or treatment facilities use when people are disconnected or disassociated from themselves, for a plethora of reasons that can happen: mental health issues, substance abuse, trauma, a variety of things. So the treatment facility helped reintegrate that kind of dual part of her. And I do believe that that's a powerful process. And I think it's wonderful for her to take her name back and really own it. I will call her what she wants to be called, because I believe that we should call people what they want to be called. Point blank, period. Whatever they say they want to be called, that's that up to them, and I'm going to be respectful. The first episode where it kind of lost me is Rachel started to talk about how the show is contrived and it's not factual. Producers claim pay was based on a good season and that she took direction well. For me, this statement took away some of the good accountability that she took earlier. Because to me, what this says is that I was a good reality TV personality. This wasn't totally my fault. I was doing what they asked me to do. And that I don't like, because we are accountable. The only person who's accountable for our behavior is us. When people hurt you or they do things to you or you hurt somebody else, whatever it is, we need to take ownership for our stuff. I think just in society, there's like a huge lack of that in general. And I feel that Bethenny kind of pounced on this because it fits Bethenny's narrative, right? That reality TV is toxic, it's a disaster. And this whole reality reckoning thing, this suits her narrative. So for me, they both took a misstep there, in my opinion. You're welcome to disagree, and I would love to hear your thoughts on that. One of the other things that frustrated me about what Rachel and Bethenny talked about is that they talked kind of about Ariana, and it's like, can we not do that? In terms, it's like Rachel claims that the relationship between Tom and Ariana, she said that if the relationship were stronger, she wouldn't have engaged in that behavior. Excuse me? What? That is insane. That is so insane. You can't make an excuse for your behavior because their relationship wasn't strong. That's not acceptable. And then Bethenny implied that, well, because they weren't an authentic relationship and because they didn't have children and weren't married, she didn't understand why it was such a big deal. That part enraged me. I'm going to be very honest. Let me be real clear. PSA right now. You do not need to be married or have children to be a legitimate family. Okay? Can we just let that sink in for a minute? That is so bonkers to me because, Emily, I'm sorry. Bethenny is engaged to Paul, right? She has a daughter with Jason, but her and Paul don't have children. So essentially, by her logic, if Paul had an affair with one of Bethenny's best friends, it shouldn't be a big deal because they're not married and they don't have kids. Boom. Turned it around. That just shows how crazy that is. Rachel claimed that she was hanging out with Tom more than Ariana, and she never spent time with Ariana off the show. So I'm not even going to go into the details of this because the details irritate me. But what I'm going to call out about this is semantics. I don't like dealing with semantics because it's a way when people use these little semantics to try to like skirt responsibility, it's a way to just like usurp their personal accountability. And I don't believe in that. I think that you can't take accountability but then say, well, Ariana and I weren't really best friends. Please, you were friends. And even if you weren't, even if her and Ariana were never really friends, it was wrong. You knew it was wrong. It was wrong. And it wasn't good for anybody. So just say that. Don't start trying to talk about Ariana and what she did or she didn't do. I don't like that. Because then that gets into, it just gets into a territory that, we don't need to get into. The one major thing that I want to talk about right now is the infamous video. Because as a therapist, as a woman, as a feminist, as a human, the rage I feel about this situation with the video makes me, I can't even tell you how angry it makes me. So here's what Rachel said about the infamous video. It was recorded on March 1st, 2023. Rachel was in New York City for Watch What Happens Live, and this incident occurred the evening before she was going on Watch What Happens Live. She stated, "I was in a nice hotel in New York City and decided to be adventurous." She stated that during the act of, to be discreet, I'll say self-pleasure, she stated that she FaceTimed Tom because I guess her and Tom FaceTime a lot. And in that FaceTime, Tom recorded her without her consent. Okay. So we've known that. We've already known that. But, Rachel talked about it and she said, "I expected to have my privacy. He recorded me without my consent. If he asked me, I would have said no." So we've known that. That's totally, absolutely insane, abusive, predatory. No, that's not acceptable. But what she said that really frustrated me is, and also to be clear, I'm taking, what her and Bethenny said, it's what they said. It doesn't mean it's true. But Rachel claims that when she confronted Tom about him recording the video, that she did it on camera. She confronted him on camera, and he claims that he wanted her to see how beautiful she was. Barf. Oh my God. I can't even with Tom Sandoval. So Rachel claims she confronted him on camera, but this next part for me is absolutely problematic if this is true. She claims that Tom threw a temper tantrum with production and he refused to film until that part was taken out. So the way that she said it was, he boycotted filming the rest of Scandival so he could have editing rights to the scene. And Bethenny claims she's seen that before. If this is true, if that happened and someone decided to take it out, perhaps there are legal reasons for that. I would imagine, and I can't speak to that. That's not my forte. I do have some Bish lawyers who have reached out, and I do plan to have some or a bunch of them on the show to speak to some of these things. But if that really happened, I feel that Bravo, it's so much darker than any of us realize. That is disgusting. If someone knew that this was happening and then decided to take it out so that Tom Sandoval wouldn't be embarrassed about behavior that, quite frankly, should put him on a list somewhere. No, that's not okay. Now Bravo has since come forth and challenged claims made in this interview about, I'm trying to look for it in my notes. Rachel said that Tom had a production or was offered a production credit for this upcoming season of Vanderpump Rules. And Bravo has since released a statement saying that that is not true. It doesn't mean that Bravo's telling the truth. Doesn't mean that Rachel's telling the truth. Doesn't mean that anyone's telling the truth. But again, if that were the case, to me, that would be incredibly problematic for Bravo. It just incredibly. So I think one of the things that I'm going to do now is I'm going to decide to make this a 2-part podcast. I know that people might not be super thrilled hearing that, but I'm looking at the recording and we're already almost 40 minutes in, and I truly have so much more to say. So for today, I'm going to leave this part here. Looking through my notes really quickly, what I'm going to leave you with is from part 1, my overall impressions, and kind of a teaser for part 2. This won't be 3 parts. Part 2 will cover the rest of my thoughts. So the first thing that struck me from part 1 of the interview is that, as I mentioned before, Bethenny never watched it. She watched clips and developed her opinions from there, which is just sloppy and messy and just, not good practice. Bethenny claims that the show was based on alcohol and affairs. The couple wasn't married, had no kids, so she didn't understand the anger. I've addressed that. Bethenny, the last thing that I commented about online that people really were interested in is that I feel like a lot of this with Bethenny is she's projecting her stuff onto Rachel. So Bethenny stated, "You could be my daughter. I would be in jail for murder if I were your mom." And there was a point where Bethenny actually started crying. She was overwhelmed with emotion, but I don't think that was necessarily for Rachel. I think it was for Bethenny. She's raising a daughter who's, a teenager now. And obviously we know about the contentious stuff with, Bryn's dad. And I think that Bethenny sees, she loves her daughter and she's very protective. And I think she's projecting her stuff onto Rachel. And, that's abundantly obvious based on her emotionality around it. Because, while crying when someone's sharing with you is an empathetic response, that's happened to me a bunch in therapy. If I'm really moved by something, that the pain that I'm hearing and what clients talk about, sure, there's tears that come up. I'm a human. But with Bethenny, it kind of feels more, there's something behind it for her. So again, that's no shade to her. What happens, we project our stuff onto people all the time, and people project their stuff onto us. There's, all of that happens. But I just wanted to give a little bit of education around that. So for today's episode, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to leave you hanging. I don't want you to have to hear me talk for another 45 more minutes. That would be crazy. So what I'm going to do right now is read my disclaimer. What I'm going to do is I do have to read a lengthy disclaimer. But instead of doing it at the top of the show, I'm going to do it at the end. So if you want to cut out early, that's your cue. So the disclaimer here is posts are not intended to diagnose, treat, or provide medical advice. Your Bish therapist is for entertainment and informational purposes only. The podcast, my opinions, and posts are my own and not associated with past or present employers, any organizations, Bravo TV, Great Heart Productions, or any other television network. The information in YBT podcast and on its social media is provided for general informational purposes only and is not intended to diagnose or treat. Please do not act or refrain from acting based on anything you read, see, or hear on Your Bish Therapist podcast or associated social media. Communicating with your Bish therapist via email and or social media does not form a therapeutic alliance. Melissa, operator of YBT, is unable to provide any therapeutic advice, treatment, or feedback. Whew. I know that's a mouthful, and I just got to do it. I got to protect myself so that I can continue to serve clinical interpretations to you all. So for this episode, thank you so much for listening. If you're watching on YouTube, thank you so much for watching. Please feel free to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Please feel free to subscribe to my podcast. And you can find links to all of it on my Instagram page, which is Your Bish Therapist on Instagram. For now, thank you so much. Your Bish Therapist signing off. Until next time.